now it's time for our second keynote from Oracle NetSuite. So we have Richard Cutler, who is a SuiteSuccess Lead in EMEA, telling about unlocking growth. So we have the pleasure to connect now in UK. James, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. So welcome to my home here, just outside of London in the UK. If I've still got a smile on my face, it's actually because of Asborn's quote in the TrimTech session. Hearing a CFO say we went to Las Vegas not to make money on the slot machines, I found quite amusing. So wonderful session from TrimTech. So I hope you are all enjoying the online format here. It's always a privilege to get a chance to present to our international audiences, this time obviously online. So as said, I have an interesting position here at NetSuite because I effectively cover two roles. So one of my roles looks after our primary go-to-market strategy, SuiteSuccess, an approach we've seen phenomenal growth with over the last fiscal year of around about 200%. My other role, as you can probably see on the screen, oversees our private capital efforts in EMEA. So my team look after relationships with some of the most European invested funds, helping embed NetSuite as a core component of their investment return strategy. Now, the interesting thing about those two roles is combined, they give me a fantastic insight in terms of what's going on in the market at any one time. So I get the sales coalface, where I get to talk with both prospects and customers about how they're reacting to the solutions we provide. Plus, I get the benefit of market strategy and where we see likely future investments happening through the engagement with the private equity partners. Now, I'm prepared to bet that a few of you have noticed that a few things have changed recently. So since particularly we originally planned to run this event in person, firstly, I've managed to recover from a torn muscle, which again is probably a good thing because I didn't really fancy limping across the stage in Finland. That's something I was a bit nervous about. The other thing we've seen is the emergence of some new trends. So I wanted to start out this session on unlocking growth, just sharing some of the observations we've seen and some of the observations we've retrieved from both customer engagements, but also from that investment community I mentioned. So first off, we've seen a lot of customers using the enforced downtime productively. So making changes where they knew they needed to be made, but they never had the time or the resources to do it. So resources have been freed up, and in many cases, that's accelerating their technology adoption. That links nicely into observation number 2, because the next thing we're seeing is that changes are happening much, much quicker. So in conversation with one of our larger equity funds in EMEA, they said the projects that previously would have taken them months in planning and execution, they're now executing in days. So they realize they won't be perfect, but the benefits of doing something far outweighs the downside. And once they've made the change, they make similar rapid adjustments as the capability starts to bed in. Key here is the concept of something called consumable change. By that, they mean they don't do too much too soon. They do what is absolutely necessary and no more. And that's also created an even bigger push towards cloud-based capability because it gives them another layer of flexibility in that journey. Another consequence of this is actually reflected in the ask we get from prospective users of NetSuite. So the go-live timelines are becoming shorter and they're becoming much more aggressive. And it's also becoming a much higher priority in the selection process when looking at either a new ERP platform or adding to the existing one. The third observation is something I'm calling provoked opportunity. So there are examples of businesses that are thriving in the current climate, but there are also some other less directly obvious aspects that we've witnessed. An example of this is better access to resource pools. So one company we spoke to said they used to recruit exclusively close to London. They now have access to a considerably larger but more diverse and frequently cheaper resource pool that could be located pretty much anywhere in the world so long as they have internet capability. again, the quote on what's the difference NetSuite's made in Trimtech's world is that flexibility of being anywhere as long as you've got that internet capability. There's also a shift, or a huge shift, if you like, in terms of what's required from the adaptation of that business, but also of the supporting partners and infrastructure behind that. Look at that resource example. They need to be supported in a different way. So let's take that through the lens of the investment companies. What are they doing? Can I have the next slide, please? First and foremost, they're reviewing and reinforcing business practices within their portfolio companies. So to make their investments more survivable. I guess it's common sense, but frequently it's something that gets overlooked. So this regular reassessment of commonly accepted practices and the motivation to address aspects of the business that no longer work. This obviously requires an adaptable mindset and not a this is always how we've done it type approach. The second thing the funds are doing is they're securing funding for emergencies and protecting the cash that's already in the business by getting deeper insights in terms of how it's moving in and out of the business or even within the business. It's actually quite scary how few organizations actually have this visibility. We see it quite frequently in the dialogues that we have with our customer organizations. The key thing here is it used to be the phrase cash is king. Frankly, it's not cash is king anymore. It's cash is the whole royal family. And again, having that visibility is becoming much more critical. To emphasize, I came across a research report recently that said that something like 40% of UK businesses have just enough money to get to the end of the 2020 period, something that's believed to be replicated across a number of different geographies. The last point here is there has been a shift in terms of where the investment money is going. So it's more towards mature, proven operations and away from the pure startup type space. That's not to say that investment stopped, it's just more cautious. But on the whole, what we're hearing is the investment companies haven't sat back. They've prepared to continue their core objective, which is ultimately growing their investments. And that all ties into the message of this keynote, which is all about unlocking growth. So next slide, please. So probably the most enjoyable part of my multiple roles is the chance to be part of some exciting customer stories, and Plenish is a really good example of that. So as you can probably tell from the image, Plenish make a range of drinks and have been a NetSuite user for a few years now. And during a conversation with their chief operating officer, he shared some insights into the reasons for investing in an ERP system. So in Plenish's case, it was their first ERP. They had some aggressive growth plans. And the big thing for them wasn't just about buying the cheapest system or getting it running quickly. It was about getting the quality and depth of automation and insight that now lives inside their NetSuite system. And it's this capability that's allowed them to grow at the pace they need to. In their own words, their old system would never have allowed that pace, mainly because the data lived previously in multiple locations. Interestingly, Reese, the COO, also described one of the big benefits of visibility, and it's kind of captured in the quote on the screen. A challenge relevant in a lot of industries, it's all about innovation. Again, go back to the Trimtech example of the HP screen print side of things. You know, some of the innovation ideas about customized clothing. In their world at Plenish, they needed to be able to work out what the customer wants, come up with a solution, and all before the customer even realized they want it. So they're trying to innovate ahead of the game, but then bring those innovations to the market in financially viable ways. And again, they can only do that if they have that insight. Candidly, the Plenish board needed some convincing to invest earlier than they thought they needed to, but the results justified the move with the description of their ERP as an absolute game changer in comparison to the multiple finance systems, multiple databases, and multiple spreadsheets that they were using previously. Stories like Plenish provide some really good evidence that getting the right systems in place can provide a huge advantage. Can I have the next slide, please? So again, the Trimtech story actually, this is kind of a link here actually, because the slide was entitled More Ready to Compete, but just hearing Ashbourne's description, again, I think it was something like 5 times increase in 10 years. Again, becoming more efficient, becoming more customer friendly. And I picked up a quote on Trimtech because I tend to follow the triathlon markets quite a bit, so I've come across the brand a few times. Making customers look good, but again, not at the expense of viability. But ultimately, this whole approach is about being more able to compete and disrupt in typically competitive marketplaces. Can I have the next slide, please? So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to lean on some research Oracle NetSuite commissioned from the raconteur entitled Unlocking Growth. The report itself interviewed, I think it was over 1,000 senior business leaders across EMEA, so different industries and companies ranging from 5 million euro turnover up to 2 million euro turnover plus. And it was looking at what was driving and what was inhibiting the growth of these organizations. Now, I'm not going to cover the whole report. We can share the ability to download it after this session at your convenience. What I am going to do is to pull on some key themes that surfaced in the report, mainly related to the use of data to help make the right investment decisions. So what did the research tell us? Well, one of the first themes that stands out is that the type of growth being pursued by the surveyed companies varies and roughly equates to the size and maturity of the business being interviewed. Have the next slide, please. So for small companies, so when we're talking at the lower end of the revenue spectrum, expansion or growth efforts tended to be focused on entering new markets, working on the principle that there is always more companies that you're able to sell to. As the size of the company grows to shift the focus more towards medium size, they're more focused on generating more from existing customers. So again, the concept now is it's easier to sell to an existing company than it is to nurture a net new one. And one of the consequences when you get bigger is this tends to place much bigger demands on things like customer management and customer satisfaction. And again, it plays into the old phrase of good news travels fast and bad news travels faster, particularly in a social media world. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, when we get to larger companies, guess what? They want the best of both worlds. So bigger companies tend to want to be able to invest in existing customers, but they also want to open net new markets. And one of the big differences now between the small and medium-sized companies was the economies of scale, or put another way, bigger companies tend to be more efficient, so they can sell less and make more profit. This is frequently represented as a shift towards bottom line growth. And interestingly, the report called out that of the organizations forecasting greater than 10% growth, most expected higher earnings growth versus revenue growth, again indicating expected efficiency gains as the organization got larger. Next slide, please. One of the big areas focused upon in the research was the role played by data. In terms of managing growth and supporting associated decision processes, being able to serve up the right information in the right format is critical. Understanding where the business is efficient, where it isn't efficient. And again, serving the right data can also help you avoid and identify things like the butterfly effect. So originally used to describe the impact on weather systems of a butterfly flapping its wings on the other side of the world, in this context, it talks to the impact of small changes being magnified and having catastrophic impact on the business operations. I'm sure you're familiar, there are quite a few well-documented cases of this problem when using Excel spreadsheets to run a business. I think the estimate is 1 in every 100 sales has an error in it. And again, that can be amplified by this butterfly effect. Unfortunately, unless used properly, it can lead to something called data overload. So as you can see, a large majority of the respondees in the research said they occasionally feel overwhelmed by the amount of data available. Like me, I suspect many of you on this call have had one or many occasions when you've stared blankly at a row of numbers, trying to make some sense of them. The answer may have been quite simple, but it was very well hidden in the noise of the other data that was then presented. And this is obviously something that needs to be avoided. So often as a direct consequence of having too much data fragmented across multiple sources and multiple applications, also known as the data's all over the place. Next slide, please. Data applied correctly, however, and the results really do start to speak for themselves. So of the audience surveyed, more than 50% of those that say they are classed as data-driven are exceeding their growth targets. Conversely, 50% of those failing to meet growth targets refer to themselves as business data unaware. Another interesting point pulled out by the report is that the preponderance to being data-driven also varied by the region of the respondees or the target companies. Germany came out as number one as a data-driven region, and possibly surprisingly, particularly to me and this audience, the UK and the Nordics were classed as lagging behind in equal last place. The importance here, again, is the link between good and accessible data and the ultimate performance of the overall business. So, as shown, growth can come in many formats and change over time as the business grows and matures and their focus adjusts. And this can frequently take the business by surprise. So it'd be new products, it'd be new markets, new countries, you talked about that a couple of times already, or even just fundamental new models. Next slide, please. The key here is all of this demands a level of agility. And again, I've heard that word a few times already in today's sessions. But that agility within the internal systems that allows you not just to identify and run efficiently, but also pivot without constraint. I used to rock climb. I hasten to add, this isn't me on this picture. You can just tell that this guy is way better than I ever was. I hasten to add, I also said I used to rock climb. I don't still do it. However, the last thing you want to do when heading up a climb is to take a set of gear that's unprepared for the terrain. So an example, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that if you're on a 50-meter high climb with a 30-meter rope, there's a chance you're taking a bit of a risk in getting to the top of that climb. Unfortunately, that happens too frequently with system selection, with the implementation of a system that's ultimately unfit for the terrain, likely into the future. And that's the problem. It might not look obvious today. This is actually a big theme with our private capital partners and something they try and spend time avoiding. The last thing that they want to do is to have to tell a prospective buyer that the business is sound, but the first thing you need to do is replace the system it runs on. That tends to have a big impact on things like valuations or even the ability to sell that business in the first place. Another trend we're witnessing in quite a few customer scenarios that also directly impacts growth and that requires agility is the hybrid business. So what do I mean by that? Well, consider a traditional manufacturer that opens a service operation or manufacturing as a service even. So used to handling maybe even complex supply chains, but not so used to handling service call-outs and the different requirements and reporting that introduces. Or maybe a software company that needs to consider the logistics of a complementary hardware product. I remember one example actually not too long ago where a colleague of mine was working on a fitness tracking business, and they also sold a tracking device to capture the data that fed into their application. So here we're introducing a number of facets that the software company normally wouldn't have to deal with, and vice versa. So the complexity of billing models, oversight on supply chain and lead times for the hardware product. Key as well, though, is that on top of that agility, you still need consistent control, something that James spoke about in the opening keynote. So more frequently than not, it is the consistent control that allows you to pivot quickly with confidence, and that confidence can have a hugely positive impact on the business outcomes. Next slide, please. The next step in that agility thing then becomes a longevity one. So we have the systems, but can they survive the test of all these changes, or more correctly, the test of growth? You'll rarely find a CFO, and I probably should have asked this as a question earlier, who has invested and implemented a system, but they're already planning to replace it. Fast growth businesses, however, do have a habit of burning things out really quickly. Again, I remember one customer engagement who came to us to discuss replacing a system they didn't even get around to completing the implementation of because they'd simply outgrown it, literally in a matter of weeks. You might ask, why didn't they know? I'm going to come back to that question later on, just to wrap up. Possibly one of the greatest benefits of NetSuite we don't talk about enough is the platform, as this is what enables future-proofing in our world. So in terms of future-proofing, we're talking about things like scaling. So starting with small number of users, but being able to grow really big. NetSuite is a good example of that because we've gone from 3 or 4 users to thousands of users now using our current system. A system that adapts. So again, we talk about hybrid models. A system that integrates. And again, I'm quite pleased to have heard about this one earlier as well, because many people underestimate how important it is to interact with other systems, particularly as you get bigger. And all of this whilst giving you confidence to stick to that initial mission without the constraint of the system you're running on. Quick story on agility. A few months back, I received a call from one of our sales teams with an interesting problem. During the implementation of NetSuite, so the customer had already selected NetSuite, the business acquired another operation. So they acquired another business. It took quite a few people by surprise, and it almost doubled the size of their user base overnight. In the old world of software, this may have stopped a few hearts. In this case, it was a pretty straightforward adjustment in the license coverage, add a new country, align the business practices, and we managed to integrate that business into the core implementation pretty efficiently. I do trivialize there a little, but I think you can see the message behind it, particularly in this new cloud world. Lastly, I couldn't leave a NetSuite presentation without this one, which is, can you operate profitably when you start operating outside of your domestic market? Maybe even on the other side of the world, managing international supply chains, or maybe just the financial regulations imposed by international markets. For a lot of growing businesses, this becomes a real challenge. It's something, again, the private capital world specializes in. Entering new markets can come with a large element of risk and frequently experimentation. An intimate understanding of what is going on in real time can really help you avoid long-term damage and allow reinvestment in the right areas, or maybe a quick exit when you find the wrong ones. Next slide, please. So just wrap up here with a couple of slides. So NetSuite's been around for a while now. Dealing with these growth and data usage problems has always been part of what we would class our DNA, and something NetSuite founder Evan Goldberg was always making sure that we could bring that large-scale ERP capability to the masses and not have it locked away in mega corporations. The great news is we've learned a lot along that journey in terms of customer behaviors and requirements. Again, the platform here is genuinely probably the most powerful thing. Because it's multi-tenanted, we can gain deep insights into what functionality gives the greatest returns, what do users use the most, what screens, what reports, what searches. Insights you just cannot aggregate when you have many different old school on-premise systems. And these insights can be used proactively to target all of the growth requirements described. So the ability to build pre-configured roles, key performance indicators and dashboards so you can deliver proven, robust experience directly through the product itself without overwhelming your users with data. The ability to recommend the right mix of functionality to generate the greatest return, helping avoid tying cash up in unnecessary capability or even lengthy deployments. And the confidence to grow your business, maybe even with a roadmap to grow it, again, without worrying about outgrowing the investment you've made. And helping your users to correctly manage the data to avoid overload, helping them look at the important stuff and not just the noise. The platform also helps us develop the solution that works for our customers, again, by looking at how customers use it or don't use it in the case of redundant capability. Next slide, please. This whole concept of learning from how our customers use NetSuite is actually where the SuiteSuccess proposition originated from. So bringing all that experience together so clients get faster return on their investment. They develop things at the right pace. So again, protecting capital. They're doing it at the lowest risk. Again, something called out in the unlocking growth research. Risk was a big, highly focused point from the people interviewed, but also survives that test of growth. Critically, this isn't just about customers new to NetSuite as well. It's also about customers that are already using NetSuite, who want to enhance their capability by leveraging pre-built knowledge on top of what they're already using. At the end of the day, though, solutions can only truly be relevant to growth if they relate to the business aspirations and can grow and adapt with them. Customers don't tend to buy just products, they buy outcomes. And that's what we've designed NetSuite and SuiteSuccess to do. And on that point, I said I would come back to the why didn't they know in my example of a company who bought a system that was right for them when they purchased it, but outgrew it in a matter of weeks. Have the next slide, please. I'm going to use a final quote here from Plenish, from their CEO. He said, "You are only as good as the questions you ask." In this case, the questions being asked were driven by short-term vision from an inexperienced team just looking to buy the cheapest option, not deeper consideration of the trajectory of their business. So in this case, unfortunately, they fundamentally underestimated the success of the proposition they brought to market, and it then caused them some delays and interrupted their future growth plans in this new system implementation approach. So can I have the final slide, please? So I really appreciate the opportunity from Staria, so I'll thank you to you. Thank you to the audience for listening. I'm more than happy to take questions in the few remaining minutes we have here, or as James said earlier, any follow-up questions as a consequence.
All right, so thank you very much, Richard, and greetings from here, from Finland. We have received quite a few questions as well. So you mentioned about report. One of our audience has asked if you could share the link to the report as well.
Yes, what we'll do is actually we're gonna post that through your Staria representatives. So we'll make sure you get a link to that after this session, so you can read it yourselves. There's a lot more content in there than we're able to cover in this session, but yes, we can do that.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Then we have a question. What is the one thing about NetSuite which unlocks growth in a best way?
Cool. So I've touched on a few topics, actually. Probably the big thing, though, again, we come back to we consider your plan, but be prepared to adjust your plan is my quote I use quite a lot with growth, because you'll rarely find a direct path to growth unless you're exceptionally lucky. So one of the big things behind NetSuite is its flexibility. Genuinely, that platform makes a huge difference to everything we do. It's what allowed us to come up with this market proposition called SuiteSuccess in the first place. We couldn't have done that without the flexibility of the platform. So it's genuinely that cloud experience. As Asborn mentioned earlier, actually, we have been around 20 years. We've been doing this for the longest. We've learned a few lessons along the way.
All right, thank you very much. Still a couple of questions as well. So for a company considering NetSuite, what would you say to convince them?
What would I say to convince them?
Yes.
So, and again, the proof is in the activity, actually. It's usually not me that convinces customers. It's usually speaking to other customers like Asborn, to be fair.
Yeah.
Go and talk to people that have used it. Go and see what they say about it. We can take you on the journey. We can provide you all the information, the roadmap, the product, etc. But if you get a chance, go and speak to someone that's had the experience we heard earlier from Trintex, because, or Plenish, another example, and a couple of the examples I didn't name personally, but we've got an enviable number of organizations that have been using our platform to massive success in growth terms. You only have to look at the IPOs that are launched on NetSuite. Again, organizations don't tend to have successful IPOs if they've not got the right infrastructure in place.
All right, nice. Then the final question for you today. What is the biggest benefit of NetSuite for a growth company, in your opinion?
Again, I'll come back to that. Actually, it's in the growth. It's the ability to actually grow, pivot, and adjust as the business grows, pivots, and adjusts. It can scale quickly. It can scale slowly if you want it to. You can benefit from all of the periphery activity. We've heard about Suite apps from Dennis earlier today. It can take you in many, many different directions. Don't get me wrong, it can't do everything, but it does certainly have the most experience of helping organizations that have aggressive growth plans, particularly if they are going international. If there's one thing from a functionality point of view that makes NetSuite stand out, it's the whole concept of something we call One World. And again, in the private capital world, when you take their advice, one of the first things they'll try and do is launch a business in a new country to exploit new markets.
All right. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to have you with this event with us as well. And I believe I speak for all Starians that we are really great to have you here. And I wish you a lovely day in the UK.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Goodbye.
Take care.